Good evening.
Hi, folks. Good to see you all this evening.
People are still coming, still gathering. As always, I will ask you to type a few words in the chat box. Located, yeah, I've just found mine. So we always would like to know about where you are in the world, what setting you're working in. Are you in private practice or in the National Health Service or in charitable organization? And whether you're working with children or adults or adolescents, maybe you are a school counselor, maybe you're working in a counseling service in university or any other team. So that's, as always, very useful, both for us and for your fellow participants. People usually really like to know where their colleagues are from, and it helps us to create a sense of community. Right, it's 7 o'clock. We'll be formally starting, and welcome to SDS Thursday. Brought to you by SDS Seminars. We are a UK-based company, and we've been going since 1990. So for almost 33 years, we've been offering professional development training for mental health practitioners from different ways of working and different places. In the UK mainly, but lately more and more from all around the world. My name is Dr. Julia Budnik. I'm one of the directors of SDS Seminars, and my co-director, Paul Grantham, will be taking you through the topic today. And the topic is OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. And another question I will ask you, if you have a moment to answer in the chat box, whether you come across OCD clients. And again, what type of OCD clients? Are they children, young people, or adults? And what kind of therapy, what kind of approach you usually take with OCD? Because tonight, Paul wanted to talk to you specific about exposure and response prevention, and it'll be interesting if you're using it in your practice. Another question I usually ask is whether you've been to SDS Thursdays before, or it is your first one, because we've noticed it was quite a lot of interest for tonight's topic. So I'm interested if there are people who are here for the first time. And if you are, how did you hear about us? I appreciate you've received an email today, but in order to receive that email, you needed to register on our website. So what prompted you? How did you discover SDS Thursdays? And what do you expect from them? Obviously, all our, regular participants are very welcome. And also, I want to say welcome to everyone who is catching up with us on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. If you're here for the first time and want to see what topics we've covered over the last 3 years now, you are very welcome to have a look at our YouTube channel and see what we've already discussed and covered. Okay. But while we're still gathering, I will attempt to share my screen because I haven't been very successful with sharing screens lately. Zoom keeps throwing me out, but I will do it for a very, very short time, and hopefully will manage. Zoom keeps throwing me out. Before you go ahead, Paul, I just wanted to say what I wanted to share with you is that Paul is going to run an event on working with OCD. And although tonight's event will not be repetition of what he's running, what he will be running is a one-day course. I will put a link in the chat box. So if you want to learn more about OCD and work with Paul in greater detail on this course, I will put the link in the chat box in a minute, and I think you still can catch late discount on that course. Let's kick off on the topic.
Yeah. So I wanted to really sort of start off briefly just by going through some basics first of all. So for those of you that are not familiar with the concept of exposure, exposure, broadly speaking, involves approach, most commonly gradually, towards a particular fear-related trigger in some particular way. So we know exposure is used extensively throughout CBT, and most typically in connection with anxiety-based problems. In terms of its use with OCD, exposure is paired. As I can see from the chat box that some of you are already aware of, it's paired with what's called response prevention. So I'll say just for a little bit briefly about that. The response prevention bit is basically about refraining from engaging in the compulsive behavior that OCD folk often suffer. So for instance, I might, when I am thinking about going out of my house, I might have a thought that goes through my head that someone might be breaking into the house or something horrific could happen to the house. So in that particular way, I have a natural inclination to avoid going out. But in order to go out or to try and go out, I engage in my compulsive behavior, which in this particular instance, I guess most commonly, it would be things like multiple checking of the door, multiple checking of locks, etc. So the exposure, in inverted commas, as it would apply to that particular context, would be exposure to going out, so repeatedly going out, but with an aim of phasing out the compulsive behavior, which is the repeated door checking or lock checking. So that occurs across a wide range of different OCD problems. Some of these, I'll obviously be talking about this in more detail on the actual training course, but some of these are overtly behavioral, but in the sense that the triggers may well be external. So if I have OCD issues relating to, for instance, contamination, then the trigger is very commonly external. For example, toilet seats would be a classic instance of that. So the treatment would consist of exposing myself to the particular anxiety-provoking trigger, which is in this instance toilets, but not engaging in the compulsive behavior that I would typically do afterwards, which would be, for instance, washing my hands with bleach or repeatedly washing my hands with soap. So that's the basics of it, and I'm sure that a number of you are more than familiar with this. Why I wanted to talk about this evening was over a slightly different issue, really, which was that the most commonly established treatment, which has got, in fact, some of the best results in terms of outcomes, is about using exposure plus response prevention in terms of dealing with OCD problems. But there's quite a bit of evidence that therapists are feeling anxious about using exposure. I think what's quite interesting about it is that I think that it doesn't become such a prominent issue with certain other types of problem which individuals might have, which require the use of exposure, so phobic problems, for instance. But somehow or other, I think it produces much greater reticence in the practitioner when this is being used with OCD. So what does that tend to mean in practice when I say that there's more reluctance to do it? I think there's two ways it gets expressed, this reluctance. One is to basically just not spend that much time on exposure because it's felt that it's quite aversive both for the client and it's aversive for the practitioner. They're worried about the client in some particular way. So there's a sort of gut instinct to try and keep this basically as short as possible, really. I think that sort of plays quite a key role with OCD. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the anxiety levels that people experience with OCD, and also I think not actually just the anxiety levels, but the strength of beliefs that are attached to the anxiety are in some ways, I think, at least in some instances, more extreme than I would come across in some clients, for instance, who are experiencing panic attacks, for example. So I think there's often quite a strong resistance in clients to doing this because they're extremely anxious about what's going to happen. So I think, as I say, one of the effects is to spend not too much time on it. The other way I think therapists often respond to this is to actually extend exposure over a much longer period. So to put it, I guess, into plain language, to take much smaller steps. And obviously, when you're taking very, very small steps, it takes far longer to get to where you actually need to get to. And I would probably also add as well that I think in the back of the minds of some therapists when they're doing this is that they wish to minimize, this is the way they would frame it, is they would wish to minimize the distress for the client. So I think that if you've made that decision to extend things over a longer period of time, it's not that big a leap to actually make, to be thinking to yourself, well, we're going to do this over quite a period of time anyway. We can always extend it further if the client shows any evidence of discomfort. So that's, I think, those are the sort of two ways that therapists actually respond to this. And I think that there is an interesting challenge here, because undoubtedly this is the most effective way of addressing certainly OCD. There's no clear evidence really of any other approach having the same degree of impact. However, there's a very big but that's attached to this, which I think is frequently not recognized, which is that when exposure and response prevention are used with OCD problems and they work pretty quickly. And when I say pretty quickly, I would typically say certainly in a single number of sessions, maybe quite substantially less than 10 in some instances. I've certainly seen it occurring over between 3 and 5 sessions. That actually occurs, but, and when I say it actually occurs, around about 3/4 of people who actually complete an exposure treatment program will actually recover. I mean, it is that effective. But, and here's the big but, there is a high dropout rate that occurs with the use of exposure. The figures on this vary. I was looking through to sort of see some of the more recent figures on this, and I suppose I was quite interested by 2 particular large meta-analyses that had been fairly recently published. One which looked at a total of over 5,500 clients who had suffered from OCD, and another one that was looking at about 1,400 clients. But in the first one, the dropout rate is 30%. And half of that 30%, by the way, occurs before exposure even begins. And that in the other one, the sort of dropout rate was around about 18 to 19%. But, you know, we're still talking about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 people actually dropping out. So I think there's a natural assumption to be made that actually the reason why clients do drop out is because exposure is very scary for them. And that for that particular reason, you know, there are some folks who are able to go through this. And if they do, you know, 3/4 of them will recover. And when I say recover here, I don't just mean small improvement. I can't necessarily say they will be back to their old selves, in inverted commas. It's worth just saying that, like most anxiety problems, OCD is often quite chronic. It's something that's been around for a long time, although by the time that someone sees a therapist, it's probably progressively got worse. But having said that, you know, there's a good chance that success will occur if you stay the course, but people don't. And what I really wanted to do, and to raise a little bit this evening, really, was to look at what that's actually about and how to actually address it. Now, there's a study that's been conducted by Ong just a couple of years ago, which specifically looked at this particular question. And they were very interested indeed in looking at the differential dropout rates between people who had been treated with exposure response prevention for OCD problems against those who had received a purely cognitive approach. And in terms of a cognitive approach here, probably the mainstay of this would be related to the use of behavioral experiments. But having said that, you know, in addition to that, there's the usual array of cognitive techniques that are actually used with OCD problems. Theory A versus theory B, the use of fairly generic Socratic questioning, cognitive restructuring. If any of this, by the way, you want to find out more about, do of course sign up to the one-day training. Yes, sorry about that. To the one-day training on this, where we'll go through it in more detail. But just to mention some of those particular things. And the interesting thing, I think, that was highlighted within the ON study was that the dropout rates did not vary. They did not vary. In fact, it was quite counterintuitive. There was an assumption that the exposure response prevention intervention would be the one that would cause the higher dropout rate for obvious reasons. But actually it didn't occur. They couldn't find any significant difference between the two. Now, my general thoughts about that are that although there is undoubtedly a difference between, for instance, exposure and the use of behavioral experiments, they both involve approaching an approximation to the thing that you're actually anxious about. Although the purpose in each is different and the way in which it's conducted is different, they both involve approach. And I think for that particular reason, in a peculiar way, this doesn't actually answer the question really about why it is that people drop out. There is, however, and I will also, can I just say, note what someone has said in the chat box about giving some references, and if I can't get them all typed up into the chat box this evening, folks, don't worry, we will make sure you get these sent out after this particular event is finished. But a paper published by Miller back in 2020 approached this whole question of why dropouts from a totally different perspective, which was, what they did was they went and interviewed clients who had OCD problems, who had gone for therapy and who had dropped out, and they were interested in their reasons why they'd actually dropped out. Now that, as you might imagine, has produced a fascinating and very rich tapestry of information, really. And I think it's something which, although has got particular relevance to the whole issue of exposure, I think it's worth mentioning because I think it's got applicability to any type of intervention that we might make. It's just that I think it's amplified particularly with exposure, but I think that the issues are the same in a peculiar way, irrespective of what modality you actually work with. So the first issue that was identified by clients in terms of why they actually dropped out had something to do with what might be broadly described as the poor quality of the relationship, except it wasn't framed in that way. It was framed in a slightly different way, which was something along the lines of, basically, I don't believe in my therapist. My therapist is going to be asking me to do something here. And first of all, I don't actually know if I trust them to make me safe while I do this. And I think the whole issue about safety is well worth thinking about. Now, I know that as CBT therapists, or those of us who are CBT therapists who are here this evening, we get very caught up with the issue of safety behaviors and the problems that they create. And I do appreciate that. But it's also important to bear in mind that when we're going to be asking clients to expose themselves to something that they find scary, and they don't know in their heads whether what's going to turn out to be the case. They have a very strong belief that something very bad is going to happen, and they have decided they are going to take a risk and actually do this. And why are they going to take that risk? They're going to take that risk in part because the person who is suggesting it to them seems credible and reliable and can be trusted. Now, that you might say, well, why wouldn't people trust somebody? And my brief answer to that is, you know, sometimes this is just about personality match, but I think it's also about the degree to which the therapist decides they're going to make it their business to create a sense of safety and security. I don't know how many of you were at I think it was last summer, was it last summer's BABCP conference? But there was a lovely photograph that was shown during one of the presentations on tolerating uncertainty. And it was a picture, I thought it was a lovely metaphorical descriptive picture. It was of a young child who has never been in a swimming pool before, who is just about to jump into the deep end. And who is there in the swimming pool but her dad in this particular photograph. And not surprisingly, she will start off from the assumption that she's going to sink. If she jumps into the deep end of the pool, she's going to sink. Something catastrophic is going to happen. Dad has said, don't worry about it. It won't happen. And I'm here to keep you safe. And ultimately, at the end of the day, whether the child decides to actually take that particular risk is very, very dependent on whether they trust dad, what their relationship with dad is like, whether they think dad, I think this is another important thing, by the way, for therapists, whether dad has the power and competence to ensure nothing bad actually happens. So there is, I think, to some extent here, an issue of trust based on perceived strength or perceived competency of the person. So that's one thing. And I think that's got some really interesting implications. I think it means that the client's attitude to exposure before it actually occurs is something that's well worth exploring. And I think there's a key role here, to be honest. I know this term is horrific for some of you, but I think there's a key role here for reassurance of the client prior to actually going into the exposure. The other thing is this whole idea of perceived competency, because it shades into the second reason why that people gave about why they actually dropped out. which was, or could be briefly summed up as, I didn't really understand the therapist's rationale for why it was they were asking me to do this. I didn't really grasp what the whole purpose of this thing actually was. Now, why I think this is important is, yes, we need to trust someone, and that's important. But in addition to that, we need to be able to see their competency, really, and to have, and part of that competency is the person's ability to provide basically a credible formulation for how this problem has come into being and how what is being suggested will help the client to actually overcome that. So the amount of time that's spent alongside the client, explaining how the problem has developed in the first place within a CBT formulation, which then naturally and automatically leads on to the treatment bit, which is going to naturally flow on from that particular formulation. So the key thing here is, and I know for those of you that are working with a very limited number of sessions, this is always tricky to do, but this would suggest if you are going to be using exposure, then if you literally leap into it on a first session, you are much more likely to get, or on a second session, you're much more likely to get a dropout rate, which is high. So in that respect, both the time that's spent in building the relationship, building the client's sense of your competency, having an underlying formulation and rationale to be able to share with the client in that's understandable to the client about how the problems come into being and how the treatment that is going to be offered links into that is going to be really important to actually do. It's interesting how that preparatory work can very easily be left out when actually it may well make the whole difference to whether the therapy is going to work or not work. So that's the second thing that's actually highlighted. The third thing that was highlighted is the thing that which was mentioned by clients in this particular study, was the one which in my opinion is least surprising, which is basically external demands or external problems that the clients actually got. So social problems, social concerns and social difficulties were highlighted. And also the other one that sort of came in second as an external obstacle for clients was a feeling that there was a general lack of support from family members regarding the problem. Now, the actual study didn't go into any more detail about what that consisted of, but I can easily imagine, again, for any of us, if we are dealing with multiple issues, of which the one that we come to therapy with, our OCD problem, is simply one of those many problems. And in addition to that, we just feel quite isolated because we don't actually have support from those around us. Not surprisingly, we're less willing to take a risk. And although I think, you know, good therapists and a good therapeutic relationship act as an antidote for some of those things, can I just emphasize, I think in many instances, they are a partial antidote, and in reality, they are also temporary as well. You know, I'm only there with my therapist for 1 hour every week. You know, the rest of the time I'm having to deal with all this other stuff that's actually around. So I don't think there's necessarily so much that one can do about as a result of that third factor, apart from maybe taking it into consideration during assessment and considering what other multiple issues are around for the client. And I don't just mean, by the way, a comorbidity with other mental health problems. You know, other issues such as existing debts, outstanding court cases, lack of security, poor quality housing, etc., which are on the mind of the client and which are going to, not surprisingly, inhibit their tendency to wish to engage in exposure. So what, yeah.
Sorry, before you go any further, can I ask you a few questions about this part so we can cover them? So am I right to say the first part about having confidence in the therapist, and you use the word reassure the client, in what way would you do that reassuring? Is it appropriate to, for example, mention that the therapist has done this particular therapy with many clients before, or mentioning some training? How do you reassure? What kind of words you are using?
I think there's a variety of options, can I say? But I'll sort of suggest some of the most straightforward and obvious ones first of all. I feel quite happy to guarantee to my client that basically if they stay with this during the course of an exposure session, I can guarantee that they will both have control over it, and in addition to that, nothing catastrophic will happen. In other words, I can guarantee that they're not going to come out feeling worse, as long as they stay with it during that particular session. We do know that, and it's worth just adding this as a caveat, we do know that if people with any type of anxiety-based problem basically end exposure to whatever it is that they're afraid of, broadly speaking, before that exposure level has dropped to its baseline, the starting point, we know that there is a much greater chance that individuals will end up with a bigger problem afterwards. So I mean, we do go into detail about this in other training, but just briefly to say that it is extremely desirable that the client basically doesn't rush out the room. Because that's there's two potential issues here where things can stop prematurely. The first one is the client rushing out the room. But the second one, of course, is that the client doesn't come back again afterwards. But it's the rushing out of the room which is going to be the biggest concern. But if the client's willing, is willing and able to stay there, and I am able to provide that security, then I quite happily guarantee that nothing catastrophic will actually happen. I also feel quite happy about just sharing that data that I mentioned to you, which is that, for folks that stay with this, 3/4 of them will near enough fully recover. And that's a high proportion. And I would probably add, incidentally, that in terms of what would be broadly described as fullish recovery, then I don't think there's any other mental health problem which has got an intervention which is near enough as powerful as that, to be honest. I mean, there are certain small phobias where you get much higher full recovery rates, but there's not very much around that is. So in that respect, I think I feel quite happy to sell its efficacy. It's easy enough for me to say that, this is also borne out by my own experience, and that's trickier for people, for instance, who've not done this work before. But I would basically say that it's really the impact that the research has in terms of determining what we can say here, and it is a very effective intervention.
So for those who haven't done much of this work before, you would recommend to go mainly with research findings and evidence-based? And if you have done, is it okay to share your own experience?
Yes, undoubtedly.
Obviously, in a confidential manner.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, can I just say, assuming your own experience is broadly positive, you wouldn't be sharing it if it wasn't broadly positive. But broadly speaking, yes.
Obviously, yeah. Okay, so that was my first question about the first part of evidence you've shared. The second one about the formulation and explanation of what the technique is about and how to do it. Would you say then, sort of, definitively that this is actually the part of the intervention itself. So just to remember that sharing the formulation and explanation of what the intervention is about is the integral part of the intervention.
Yes, and maybe I can just say a little bit more about why I think it is. There's exposure as an intervention has been argued as being the most powerful and effective psychological intervention for personal change that's ever been developed. And I you know, that idea of feel the fear and do it anyway, you know, all of those ideas about the value of stretching yourself and taking a risk, all of that is actually about exposure in some way. And I sort of fully agree with that, that's something which really basically needs to be a part and parcel of the way we actually approach this. But there was a pre-cognitive theory, amazingly, about how exposure worked, which was developed by a clinical psychologist back in the 1960s. And before everyone says, gosh, did you really study them, Paul? No, I didn't. And interestingly enough, I actually only heard about this study, which was published in 1966, at a conference in 2019. And I'd heard of the guy, but I'd never read any of his stuff. And his basic argument was, or his summary statement for his research on this was, exposure works by disturbing expectations. Exposure works by disturbing expectations. People expect something bad to happen, basically, and exposure enables them to discover that it doesn't. Now, that to me, for a man who was a big researcher in behavior therapy, sounds and was originally a rat and lab man, sounds suspiciously cognitive to me. But I think that whole idea of being able to disturb people's expectations, to enable them to see things in a different way, and to also discover whether that's actually true, I think is absolutely central. And part of that process, coming back to your original question, part of that process is achieved, that disturbance of expectation is achieved by sharing with the client a formulation of how this problem has come into being. Because once you can see the formulation, then it immediately creates a doubt that your original expectation that something catastrophic is going to happen, or is certain to actually happen, becomes at the very least begins to be disturbed in some way. And I think that slight cognitive disturbance at the beginning is really quite important in terms of bringing the person in to be willing to expose themselves in that way.
Thank you. I obviously will not ask you to do it tonight, but just a question, will you talk of formulation for OCD during the course?
Yeah.
Right, okay, well, that's good. Now to the third part of the evidence, and it actually goes well with the comment which Anand made, because he does mention that there are triggers which are persistent. Sometimes he works with young people in their family life, domestic stress, academic stress. So it's linked to the third part of evidence which you gave us about other factors which affect people's behavior. So what would you say? Do we go for the intervention if we know that there are so many other factors which affect people's life? How do you make that decision?
I think it's a very difficult decision to make. And to be honest with you, I think at this particular stage, we don't know enough to answer that. So all I think I would say at this stage is be aware of the fact that it's a factor. And if you are having to make decisions about whether someone is going to receive therapy or not receive therapy, and I do appreciate not everyone's in that position, but if you are in that particular position, particularly within an organizational context, it strikes me as being valuable to take it into account. The difficulty is that, first of all, very few of our clients ever have just one issue. Many of our clients will not have the most supportive backgrounds in terms of doing things. And as I often say, one of the biggest problems that our clients have generally is not that they do the wrong thing, it's the fact they do the same wrong thing repeatedly. And, to get out of that, you need to be willing to be a bit experimental. And this is about, from a client's perspective, being more experimental. And it's not as easy to do when you feel that you have not got the support outside the room. It's not so easy to do when you've got other worries that are piling up and you feel you've got enough to be dealing with at the moment. But I think it's I can't be categorical about that. Really, I just think I would be wanting to at least spend a little bit of time exploring it and asking the client really whether that is something which they feel that they give it, whether basically they feel that they can proceed with therapy, rather, or whether this is something that they will prefer to leave to another time, really.
Okay, okay. You mentioned disturbing the expectations. Just a brief question I have. What's then the difference between exposure and behavioral experiment? Because both are designed to disturb expectations.
Okay. Very, very brief. Well, the first thing I would say, by the way, if you want a more detailed explanation of this, do come along to the introductory course that we actually run on CBT, because we will unpackage that difference in much more detail. But in brief, I think there are two main differences between the two. I think that first of all, the focus within behavioral experiments is the person's beliefs. So that is what we zero in on, their beliefs about what's going to happen, and to basically explore whether those beliefs are true or not by doing something to test it out. The focus within exposure is always the emotion. So we, in a sense, what we are primarily interested in during someone's exposure is not above anything else what they're thinking, but to basically look at ratings of their anxiety levels, which will drop, first of all, will go up and then will drop according to a pretty set pattern. But it's important, that there's going to be quite structured checking in on that and self-rating of anxiety during the course of that. So that's sort of, one's a focus on cognition, one's a focus on emotion. The other big difference between the two is that basically behavioral experiments are quicker. They're just quicker. So, as I often say, you get a bigger bang for your buck, basically, with behavioral experiments. They create change much more rapidly. So you might, I guess the following question on from that is, why not use them all the time then? And I think there's two answers to this. I think that it's often underestimated how individualized behavioral experiments have to actually be. They're not something you can easily manage. There are some simple behavioral experiments which you can sort of pull off the shelf and use for certain types of problem, but a lot of them require individual tailoring, because one of the key things in behavioral experiments is to anticipate in advance yes but questions. And what you don't want is the yes but questions occurring after the experiment, which basically undermines it. You want to be able to deal with those before the experiment occurs. Now that often means quite a lot of individual fine-tuning, not on the basic principle of it, but on the way in which it's actually operationally put into practice. So I think it's more demanding. I don't think it's as straightforward. I think some people would complain that with behavioral experiments, it takes more time designing them. And that's pretty time consuming as well. But also I just think that you can't totally underestimate the value of experiential learning where arousal levels are raised. And I think in that respect, what you do get with exposure is you get a guarantee that that's going to happen, basically. And so I'm loath to say it's going to be one rather than the other. I mean, there are some things, can I hasten to add, which there are some types of OCD problem that don't lend themselves very well to exposure. So for instance, I mean, you can do it, but if, for instance, I have an OCD problem which relates to intrusive thoughts, which I consider to be blasphemous, for instance, when I have those intrusive thoughts, I've got to go and wash my hands for 20 minutes with soap. Then although the response bit, the hand washing, is fairly similar to what you would have with a different type of OCD problem, trying to enable people to go through exposure in the classic sense of the term in terms of imaginal exposure with this is actually quite tricky. You know, there's too much opportunity for many people, I think, to just engage in avoidance. You know, thought suppression is such a common strategy that so many people use, I think it's less likely to be the case. Whereas I think a behavioral experiment works much more effectively with those.
Thank you. Sorry, I've interrupted you, so I'll let you to carry on where you were going to go, if you remember where you were going to go.
Right. Let me just come back to an interesting question. Here we go. Kieran said, we're telling them nothing catastrophic will happen, not serve as a reassurance or prevent them tolerating uncertainty. Really good question, Kieran. Because one other danger that's around, or which I think that often crops up with exposure, is ongoing reassurance. And I think you're quite right. That is undoubtedly a potential danger. In many ways, it's about encouraging an ongoing safety behavior, which will substantially limit the effectiveness of the treatment. In a peculiar way, you may well be replacing one particular safety behavior in terms of the person's natural response with another one, which is reassurance seeking from the therapist. So, okay, it may well be the case that I don't necessarily feel the same inclination to go and wash my hands with bleach after something. Instead, what I want to do now is to ring up my therapist every 5 minutes to just double check things are okay. So I know exactly what you're talking about with that. But I think there's a sweet spot here that's to be found, really. And that's why I said earlier on, I do appreciate that the term reassurance here can create a reaction in us as CBT therapists. I think there's a sweet spot to be found here, which I would largely see in the setting conditions and reassurance that's provided before things start. And that I do think is of value. Where I think we're going to start having a problem, and I mentioned that for the reasons I gave earlier, really, which is we're advocating to the client that they take a risk. So in that particular instance, I think that providing that reassurance so the person can then take the risk is great. So in exactly the same way with the swimming pool metaphor, it's fine if dad says, come on, jump in, it's safe, I'll be here, nothing will happen. Okay, and basically the child never progressing beyond that. The child always coming back to dad and wanting reassurance and never getting enough reassurance and wanting lots of reassurance before they actually jump in. And of course, what would dad be doing in that situation? Dad would be phasing out his reassurance and will say, you know, you've done this before, you know nothing bad actually happens, come on. That they wouldn't be providing the same level of reassurance that they did at the beginning. And I think that's the case here. But I do think you've hit a point there, Kieran, which is worth bearing in mind, because I think that if the therapist is feeling uncomfortable with exposure themselves, they are more prone to responding to the demands of the client for ongoing reassurance. Whereas I think if the therapist is comfortable with exposure, I think they find it easier to resist those ongoing demands. Right, interesting issue that Jill raises here in the chat box, that maybe assurance rather than reassurance would be a better term to use. Maybe so, if you feel more comfortable with that. So yes, the other thing is about tolerating uncertainty. And what I would actually say about tolerating uncertainty is I largely see the toleration of uncertainty as being an important part of cognitive interventions. So if you're going to be going down at least partially cognitive route, then there may well be some value in helping the client to look at their beliefs about uncertainty and attempt to increase their tolerance of it. The only thing I would say about this is that in my experience, it almost invariably tends to be slightly more time consuming. So if it has to be done, it has to be done. But, you know, there are some more established and more rapid routes to a good outcome here, which don't necessarily require that. So there will be undoubtedly some folks where that is of value, but I would be wary of seeing it as being a necessity across the board in terms of specifically focusing on that, or seeing that as a key, as an essential rather, mechanism. So sorry, I rabbited on there a bit long.
That's okay, but because we are approaching 8 o'clock very, very quickly, I won't be taking any more questions at the moment. But what I wanted to mention, that I've put the link to the open course. If you can, please come to the open course, and then you'll have many more opportunities to ask questions about your clients. We currently have early bird discount, and you are saving £45 before that, so it's a pretty substantial saving, and it expires on the 14th of March. So if you want, just click on that link and the course will open for you. I also put another link, SDS Seminars Online, which is a link to a video demonstration of ERP with the client. And if you want to see how it's done, it's with Dr. Fiona Kennedy, and Paul interviews her on that as well. So you can click on that link and watch the demonstration with the client. So I hope we will see you on the course. If you can't make it on the day, the full recording will be available to everyone who booked on the course. So book it now, and you will receive the recording. And for now, thank you very much, Paul. It was very interesting and useful. Please send me the link and we will send it to people, to that research which you've mentioned. And you can unmute yourself and say your goodbyes, and I hope to see you at our next Thursday. Thank you.
Yeah, good to see so many people here. You take care.
Bye.
Love yourself.
So,
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
thank
Yeah.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So many faces.
Bye.
It's wonderful.